Good evening, everyone. My name is Elisa Iturbe. I am an assistant professor here at the Cooper Union, and I would like to welcome you to the third event in the Architectures of Transition series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this lecture series is motivated by the fact that we've reached an ecological brink, and against this daunting horizon, architecture's response has been undeniably insufficient. As we know, the climate crisis is intensifying unabated, and this is in part because architecture, as both a discipline and a practice, continues to replicate the spatial, cultural, and material patterns that constitute an energy-intensive way of life. So in that light, this year's lecture series is going to interrogate architecture's allegiance with the project of carbon modernity, from the early moments of industrialization to today's advanced stages of fossil capitalism. At stake, of course, is architecture's role in broad civilizational transition, which was unquestionably problematic during the last transitions into fossil fuels, yet at the same time is indeterminate and full of possibility as we look forward to the transitions to come. This challenge is multivalent, and it's going to require not only rethinking what we design and draw and model, but also we have to question the nature of the institutions within which we work. So today the conversation is going to be a bit different from the previous two events in this lecture series, but no less important because it's going to be a discussion about institutional change. I believe that this is a crucial conversation because even though I'm one of the first to say that architecture as a discipline has much to offer in these times of crisis and of change, it's also true that the skills and the spatial thinking that we bring to the table will have limited impact and limited efficacy until there are profound changes to the institutions within which we practice. So that includes the institutions where we educate ourselves as architects, and it includes the profession itself. So in that context, I believe that the conversation we're about to have today could not be more urgent. So without further ado, let me introduce our participants. Today's event is a combination of a lecture and roundtable, and we're hearing from two groups. From within our institution, we have a representative from the Cooper Climate Coalition, which is an open body of students, faculty, and staff at the Cooper Union that facilitates conversations, events, and student projects within the institution that center the climate crisis and its intersections with races, classes, genders, sexualities, histories, economies, political structures, and more. Along with organizing Cooper Union's Climate Week programs and events in the fall, the Climate Coalition takes responsibility for fostering interdisciplinarity throughout the Cooper Union in support of environmental action. This group has been actively working on bringing about institutional change. Last year, at the request of President Laura Sparks, using data collected across campus, the coalition drafted a working document outlining its position on how best to create lateral institution-wide transition towards a climate-just institution. This year, they're working with the President's Office and graduate students from the BARD MBA in Sustainability program, working to create an institution-specific sustainability action plan. They are represented tonight by Simon Garb, who will speak first. We will also hear from the Green New Deal working group of the Architecture Lobby, who will deliver a lecture titled A Just Transition for Architecture. The Architecture Lobby is an international organization of architectural workers, planners, and designers, advocating for the value of architectural labor in both the discipline and the profession. The Green New Deal Working Group is one of their many working groups, and it's a horizontal and democratic organization with many chapters, campaigns, and working groups. Now, at this point, I have to confess that I am wearing two hats tonight because I'm not only the host of the event, but I'm also a member of the GND working group myself, and I have been since its founding. So in a moment, I'm actually going to abandon my post here as your host, and I'm going to disappear into the rank and file. And in fact, I'm going to conduct the proper introduction of the working group from there. But while I'm still here, I just want to say that as the curator of this lecture series, I didn't invite the Green New Deal Working Group as an act of promotion, but because within my own work, and specifically the work that I do related to climate change and environmental matters, I'm often hard-pressed to find a group of people that really understands the depth and the scope and the urgency of the problems that we face. The GND Working Group is where I have found a heterogeneous but radical group of thinkers, all in different moments of their career, all with different relationships to practice. but united in their awareness of the fact that because of what faces us, we must move mountains. And whether we succeed or not, we don't know, but what I do know is that this group is up to the task. So with that, I'm going to transition into my other role tonight, which is one of the hundreds of members of the Architecture Lobby, and more specifically, a member of the Green New Deal Working Group. And I will hand it over to Simon, who will speak for the Cooper Climate Coalition.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and being here and for making this happen. As was said, my name is Simon Garb. I am actually School of Art student. I'm a junior. And I am a representative of the Cooper Climate Coalition. I do a lot of administrative stuff, so if you ever DM us or send us an email, it's likely me who's at the other end of that. I really want to thank the Green New Deal Working Group for being here with us and for including us and sharing our work with us here at Cooper. I want to extend a special thank you to Professor Iturbe for including us and just for being a champion of climate at Cooper for forever. So what is the coalition? So this language was already used, but I want to go over it again because I think it's actually really important. So just to do a little bit slower, the Cooper Climate Coalition, an open body of students, faculty, and staff at the Cooper Union, facilitates conversations, events, and student projects within the institution that center the climate crisis and its intersections with races, classes, genders, sexualities, histories, economies, political structures, and more. So this piece of writing is really special to me for a couple reasons. One being that it was co-written in real time. It was written on a Google Doc over Zoom, so there was active collaboration with multiple people. It's gone through multiple eyes. It's almost 3 years old now, and it still kind of rings true. We understand that the Climate Coalition does not affect everybody at the same rate and with the same wrath, right? And so we use interdisciplinarity as a means of at least addressing somewhat that inequity. So the coalition, I'm going to talk about the projects that we're doing currently, as were mentioned a little bit, but before I do that, I want to give a little bit of context for the coalition. So the coalition was founded the seeds were planted, no pun intended, in 2019 with the Cooper Union Climate Week, which was a wonderful series of events put together by alumni Sophie Schneider and Elisa Petrosova, along with Professor Amanda Simpson of the Chemical Engineering Department. And at least from my perspective, it inspired a whole bunch of political will and excitement around climate at Cooper. But the concept of having a group with like a name and an email address and all that really came from COVID. And it came as a kind of communal organizing space for to be together over Zoom, to grieve about the pandemic and about climate, to feel like we were doing something, to build knowledge. And from that, the way we started to think, or the way that I understand the coalition as it builds off entirely the ethos of the institution of Cooper Union, right? And it doesn't necessarily veer away from that very much. So thinking about Peter Cooper, his fortune, right? Incentivizing a global carbon economy through anthracite coal, through industrialization, through building this city. Free education for a free society, right? What are the consequences of that? What does that mean? And what does that mean in 2022 specifically? And art, architecture, and engineering, right? Fully all-encompassing in how we as a species think about the built environment, our relationship to the natural world, and how we kind of conceive of it. So one really important thing, I think, in terms of organizing is that there's no bar for entry into the coalition. Students, faculty, and staff are all welcome. Colleagues of students, faculty, and staff are all welcome, and they participated in different capacities at several different points over the years, and we're so much the better for it. Pretty much the only the bar for entry is that you have to believe in climate change. and we haven't had any issues with that yet. So as Nada Ayad likes to say, who's a professor of HSS here at Cooper, come as you are, stay as long as you like. The Climate Coalition is a place actually for joy, right? For laughter, for socialization, which I understand is a weird thing to think about in the context of like what is potentially a mass extinction event. But we're privileged enough to be in school, and I think that we should use whatever tools we have to sort of subsist, and that is one of them. So to say that it is not all free labor and doom and gloom at the Coalition, it's a social space as well. And I wanted to bring in some language from our neighbors over at NYU, Professor Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, from their book, The Undercommons, and think about the term study, right? So in their book, The Undercommons, Moten and Harney don't use study in the typical definition that we think of it as. Rather, study is a collective form of knowledge building that is collaborative and that comes from a place of communal care. And that doesn't exist within the logic of the institution, but certainly as a result of it, or as a consequence of it, right? So it's not formalized. That is all to say it's kind of about being together, right? And so this is an example of some of the knowledge that we've built together. And I think about this and look at this all the time. It's a lexicon that we've built to help ourselves think about climate. And the end goal of the Coalition is that one day we will become redundant. My comparison for New York City schools is as if FIT had a fashion club, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. Everything they do is already a part of it. Why would they do that? And that's a long ways down, obviously, but I think we all here in this room at least see the logic in that and see that as a possibility. And so coming back from COVID presented a bunch of new challenges for the Coalition as an organized body. The drudgery of New York, needing to be at a certain place at a certain time, having social life that's informal anyways, and that is not digital. And so it's been a little bit of a weird sort of year and a half where we've been fighting against that, but we're very fortunate to have a president currently who sees the value in this kind of extra institutional organizing. And so last year, our president, Laura Sparks, talked to us and was basically like, okay, we understand your thinking, right? We've heard you. Come up with a piece of literature, a document that tells us, the president's cabinet, the president's office, how to initiate a move towards sustainability that is not dogmatic, that is lateral, and that is specific to this institution, and that hears its voices. And we were like, cool. So for the next couple months, we ran around the school and collected as much data as possible in labs, in studios, doing tabling events, digital media, to try and get as much data as we can. And obviously, this is a working document. It's not done, and it can't possibly represent everybody, even though it says it tries to, but we all understand that. So the document is called, the Proposal for Actions in Support of a Climate Just Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. And basically, it's broken up into two sections. A mission statement, which is kind of everything I just told you, and then this sort of material and communal. And there's a blank space left in the middle for those overlaps. And so the material stuff, right, is the stuff that, it's material. It's things that you can identify as being done. You can check them off on the list. In conversations, we've identified them as the low-hanging fruit. I'm not sure that that's true, but they are things that are identifiable, right? So one of the first major points being install materially circular and sustainable practice into the infrastructure of Cooper Union's campus. So things like enrolling in a composting program, signing on to the Green New Deal, the green chemistry commitment, and like really easy things like double paned windows in the sculpture labs. Transition all Cooper Union facilities and buildings away from fossil fuels to completely renewable energy, developing a zero carbon plan in line with Local Law 97. So if you don't know, Local Law 97 is part of New York City's goal to be completely carbon neutral by 2050. And they're going to start fining buildings with a certain carbon emissions threshold, passing a certain carbon emission threshold in 2025. We are on track to be fined. So really good, really easy identifiable thing right there. Divestment. Now, this is a very complicated one, specifically for the specificities, of Cooper's financial situation. We understand that this is probably something that is legally not possible before a return to free. So it will always remain on the cork board, right? And it will be something that we look to and think to and aspire to and think of as important for all institutions of higher education, but we also understand that it's a transitional period, right? And then with that, developing a transparent plan for responsible investing. And then the communal is the kind of hearts and minds stuff, right? So it's the stuff that exists that's intangible. And obviously there are overlaps between the two sections. So see to the integration of a materially circular and academic praxis revolving around the climate crisis. I wanted to point this out as an example because it's a really good point of contention, which is prohibiting ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, or any other fossil fuel company from participating in the Cooper Union in any way, specifically in our career fairs. At the same time, right, understanding that these companies are some of the last ones that can easily provide an engineer or an architect, or maybe even an artist with a healthy and sustained middle-class life. And that is not something to be taken lightly. So those two things existing at the same time. Provide resources to ensure the integration of climate justice and material circularity into every active division of the Cooper Union in perpetuity. So this is basically to say, we don't care if it's the president's office, the dean's offices, or like the alumni association and advertising, right? Everybody here has a job. Everybody here has a sphere of influence within the apparatus of the institution. And we want them to have some kind of toolkit to think about that sphere of influence that they have and guide it towards a climate just model, a sustainable model. So nothing is too small, right? And then establish a democratic structure for continued input from and transparency with Cooper Union on the part of the administration consisting of any number and or combination of institutional structures. So I think one of the biggest things we found out while putting this document together, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room can relate, is thinking about not having enough time to think about climate. We go to a rigorous institution. If we're students, we're very passionate about our disciplines. We are not paid to think about climate if we're working here, right? And we work a certain number of hours. So this is to say that we suggest that the institution do a full-time hire, right? Create a class, do a committee, anything that works and that is necessarily institutional, that is easily identifiable, that students, faculty, and staff can go to create a pathway of narrative, right? Talking about anxieties about climate transition in Cooper and transparency on the part of the institution. There needs to be a centralized point from that is not extra institutional in the way that the coalition sort of is. So, very pleased, right, to announce that, as Professor Iturbe said, we have made this document and the President's Cabinet and the President's Office have heard us somewhat, and we are beginning to plan. We're planning to plan, as they say. So a group of students from the BARD MBA in Sustainability have graced us with their presence, and throughout the rest of the semester, they'll be sort of giving us a toolkit, giving the President's Office the toolkit to initiate a sustainability plan. So there will be more meetings about that. They will involve students, faculty, members of the cabinet. The dates on those are not totally set, but if you are here and you're interested in being a part of that, you can come talk to me afterwards or DM Cooper Climate or email climate@cooper.edu. It's really exciting. And we have a meeting tomorrow. There's going to be food. It's on the second floor of this building, room 201 at 12 o'clock. I'm told people don't have class then. And yeah, that is what I have. Climate Coalition. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Simon, for that. Okay, so I'm going to continue my introduction. And first, I just want to say a few words about the Architecture Lobby. As I mentioned, the Architecture Lobby is an international organization of architectural workers, planners, and designers. And the lobby advocates for the value of architectural workers. The work that architects do, aesthetic, technical, social, organizational, environmental, administrative, all of this needs structural change in order to advance spatial justice. So for those of you that don't know the lobby consists of chapters, campaigns, and working groups. It's a heterogeneous, horizontal, and democratic organization united by its interest in the conditions of architectural labor. So the Green New Deal Working Group is one of many working groups that the lobby has, and we're focused specifically on how architectural labor intersects with the unfolding of the environmental crisis. So we're a national group, but we happen to have many members that are in New York City, which is why we have so many members here on the stage. Unfortunately, our members that live in other places couldn't be here tonight, but hopefully they're watching on Zoom. I'm going to allow each member to introduce themselves so that you have a sense of who we have here. So Adair, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, I'm Adair. I'm an architectural designer working in private practice in New York on subsidized affordable housing.
Hi, good evening. My name's Kevin Bogle. I'm a public sector landscape architect designing and building parks, playgrounds, and plazas around New York City.
Good to see everybody. I'm Josh Barnett. I'm also public sector, working on public housing. Yeah.
My name is Martin Wiener. I'm a sole practitioner here in Brooklyn, and I work mostly in commercial interiors and residential projects.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Watson. I'm a licensed architect in New York, working at a private firm that does primarily public projects.
Hello, my name is Ryan Ludwig. I am a licensed architect in New York, but I am a full-time academic at the moment, and I teach in a small private school outside of Providence, Rhode Island.
Great, thank you. So we're going to deliver a lecture tonight titled "A Just Transition for Architecture." And just in terms of what our working group is specifically, if that was the context of the lobby, which, I gave this context already, the Green New Deal Working Group specifically advocates for liberatory principles and ecological justice as they relate to architectural labor, the built environment, and sustainable futures for all. So this group formed in 2019 when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez released the first piece of Green New Deal legislation. That legislation speaks explicitly about the built environment. So on one hand, this was very exciting and promising, and yet as architects, we felt that there were many gaps in the legislation. So our group formed in that moment around a shared concern for how change happens in the built environment. And there was a feeling in that moment that the Green New Deal presented an opportunity because there was going to be an influx of federal funding, and so it might be possible that the very nature of design commissions might change, or that our working conditions might change. So we wrote a policy response document, and this was many years in the making, and this is actually one of the most recent things we've done. But it started as a series of policy recommendations that were a direct response to the legislation as it was written, but it really ended also as a series of demands, because in the process of writing, there was a realization that our very work is compromised in terms of us being fossil fuel workers, us being embedded into an economy that demands way too much energy, way too much material, way too much extraction. So due to the economy of the built environment itself, our work was compromised. And we felt that the Green New Deal legislation, although it was understanding that the built environment was heavily implicated, did not quite understand that. So there was a moment in which we wanted to imagine ourselves also as a political constituency which could make specific demands on behalf of the built environment. So you're going to hear a lot more about this document later on, but these are some of the demands that we made in that document: a demand to reform practice, redefine resilience, reassess technology, and re-empower labor. We've also done many other things over the course of our time as a working group. We've organized many events. We had a series of events all over the globe during Earth Week a couple years ago. We also created a power mapping tool, which is an organizing tool that one can use in order to understand the political landscape around a specific campaign. And this is a tool that we've now shared with the rest of the lobby and that many of the campaigns and working groups use. And then we've also been focused on outreach and organizing, which you'll hear a little bit more about. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adair, who's going to talk more specifically about our conditions of labor. And Adair, the floor is yours.
So the lobby really formed around this. Decades of anti-labor sentiment, spiritualization of creative personality, creative calling, the profession's general middle-class culture has made it really difficult for architects to see themselves as workers. So even as our work conditions have devolved, sleepless nights, unpaid internships, unpaid overtime, there's a pride that's maintained in creative work. But this status that we have, this status of learned professionals, it's a middle-class joke. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, our status leaves us unprotected by minimum wage standards and without mandated overtime pay. So the message of the lobby has been, if you don't have the power to hire, fire, or discipline, you're a worker and you have shared interests with other workers. Individuated, we have no power, neither over our projects nor the conditions of our work. What the GND group has kind of pushed forward on top of this, or as a complement, is that we aren't just workers, but we are fossil fuel workers. Like the energy sector, the building sector operates at the heart of the fossil fuel economy. Our projects entail the mobilization and consumption of enormous quantities of material, land, and energy. And our livelihoods as workers in this industry is dependent on continuous construction and thus ecological destruction. So, without organizing as workers, we maintain that we have little recourse to participate in decarbonization. Because we're within the building sector, and a well-known fact that many of us in the profession hear, like weekly, more perhaps, is 40% of annual greenhouse emissions come from the building sector. This statistic has been put to hard work, opening conversations about practice reform, decarbonization, energy retrofit, to create new markets for green products, and to revitalize real estate management practices. We're here because we think this conversation can't end with building performance. It has to center labor. From our perspective as architectural workers, our work within the building sector is bound by three industries deeply implicated in the fossil fuel economy. Our own, architecture, engineering, and construction, henceforth AEC, everything involved in building delivery and development. The building products industry, everything involved in material and component design, manufacture, and extraction. And the real estate development industry, everything involved in property, land, and asset management in the built environment. So, AEC is a service industry within a capitalist society. As such, it consists in the aggregation of individual building and infrastructure projects, which are produced through a mixture of market incentives, directives, and speculations. Within this context, workers have little say in the larger environmental impact of their work. The market rules. Despite decades of sustained climate advocacy, there's only been superficial reform, as sustainable design only pencils when policy makes it. So, even if we could have a sustainably designed building, one that's energy efficient, loose fit, with a long lifetime, it would still be made of an assembly of building products. And building product manufacturers, less consistently the subject of policy incentives, are even more disciplined by the market. They're driven to use greenwashing and lobbying to ensure the ubiquity of their products assemblies, and construction techniques, which in turn creates inertia in the built environment around existing supply chains and carbon-intensive practices. And so greener products replace their fossil fuel predecessors as a one-to-one swap with a purchase certification never held to account for their planetary impact. So a chemical company like Milken, which manufactures nylon carpets, can keep selling throughput, that is destined for landfill, petro products under a carbon neutral label while getting recognized as one of the world's most ethical companies, and in the meantime, fund the Alliance to End Plastic Waste with the 8 top single-use plastic manufacturers, Shell, PepsiCo, Procter & Gamble, Dow Chemical, and ExxonMobil. But let's say we could source an all-sustainable, 100% regenerative products, we'd still be ruled by the real estate industry, which commissions and directs our work. Oops. Real estate, the speculation on future land value, and the capture of rents is our primary medium for determining land use. As a result, change in the built environment is driven primarily by wealth accumulation, rather than by community necessity, ecosystem stability, or public health. The real estate market cannot be incentivized to create an equitable built environment. In the decades since the Fair Housing Act, income segregation in the United States has only increased. Climate breakdown will only exacerbate systemic racism and the injustices of resource inequality. As we face the decline in the livability of entire regions, only the wealthy will be able to relocate to climatically stable regions. We will not see change until municipalities are no longer dependent on private development to provision social infrastructures and support their tax base. So, we need to push the building sector. We need to push to resist our position as service workers to financial capital, to have alternatives to energy-intensive, ecologically destructive products, and to create places where human life and ecosystems take priority over concentrated profits. We need a just transition.
So Adair has laid out the case and need for a just transition, and our colleague from the Cooper Climate Union has described what that might look like, but what exactly is it that we're advocating for here? A just transition is a shift towards real sustainability and environmental justice. It provides legislative and economic support for workers in industries requiring reform away from harmful processes of production, away from environmental degradation, and away from community harm. Historically, this has succeeded in aligning material interests of industrial workers with social justice and environmental movements, transcending the jobs versus environment divide. Now, while building sector unions have traditionally been pro-growth, current movements toward unionization within private sector architecture and engineering firms have the potential to shift this dynamic. Through a just transition, workers can organize to reform industries that have socially and environmentally harmful impacts. A just transition is a political movement advocating the shift from an extractive to a regenerative economy in a way that is just and equitable and also redresses past harms through reparations. The just transition could equally refer to workers at a local power plant as to the financial help that rich countries owe poorer countries in the world to repay their carbon debts. One key question that we can ask ourselves to tell if something is really a part of a just transition versus more corporate bullshit greenwashing is, are these strategies defined by those that are first and most affected? All decisions, designs, policies, and investments that determine change for any sector need to be led by those workers and communities most affected by the sector. So we're moving from an extractive economy, which is a worldview of overconsumption fueled by resource extraction, and neocolonialism geared towards the enrichment of the 1% at the expense of exploited workers. Extractive economies will consume the entire earth with no accounting for resource scarcity or workers' rights in order to make the rich richer. We're moving towards regenerative economies. Conversely, a worldview of caring and sacredness fueled by regenerative practices and deep democracy, geared towards ecological and social well-being and based on mutual cooperation. The non-financial valuation of the earth as sacred in and of itself and of care for the world and each other fuels development and social change based on deep democracy and is geared towards mutual cooperation and benefit rather than individual enrichment. However, we must recognize that a just transition is currently contested terrain. Similar to the greenwashing and co-opting we've seen across sectors over the last decades, the same systems and practices that have led to our current socio-ecological crises are now injecting themselves into the conversation as the sole agents that are able to resolve the problems that they themselves have created. When trying to discern if something is truly a part of the just transition or more corporate greenwashing, we can ask, who's speaking? Are these strategies defined by those first and most affected? When we read, for example, that the just transition must include a vibrant oil and natural gas sector, who do we imagine is making this claim? Is it ONG industry lobbyists, or is it the frontline communities most impacted by the harmful effects of these sectors? Industry paints themselves as agents of social responsibility. For decades, they have successfully waged propaganda campaigns to promote individual actions in lieu of the systemic change. And now these masters of the universe are claiming that only they can undo the harm that they've caused. This is a defensive posture in the face of growing resistance to the increasing visibility of injustice, extraction, and exploitation. These industries are deeply afraid of losing their social license to operate and are doing anything and everything they can to continue business as usual with a green veneer. Electric cars aren't here to save the planet, they're here to save the car industry. These industries see the greening of the economy as a new market and opportunity for growth. The amount of corporate greenwashing happening in this very moment is really, really remarkable. It's key to note that the transition is already underway. Transition to respond to a world ravaged by climate change is inevitable. Justice is not. Currently, the transition that we're seeing is far from just, and we're seeing negative impacts globally in the form of displaced emissions, land theft, mineral extraction, political destabilization, and coerced labor. As Elon Musk tweeted out in response to suspicion that he had participated in a political coup in Bolivia to access lithium reserves for batteries for EVs, he said, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." This is not the just transition that we're fighting for, and in this context, transition is a cruelly euphemistic phrase for the drastic effects that communities are already facing. Globally and locally, we need to come together and work for justice because it is far from a foregone conclusion, and we can work together today to fight for a better future. Through a just transition, workers can organize to reform industries that have social and environmental harmful impacts. Together, organized workers and social movements can build the political power necessary to secure workers' rights and livelihoods while protecting the environment.
So hi, it's good to see everybody. Said I work for the public sector and public housing. You pay my salary. Unless you're Jeff Bezos, you don't pay taxes, but I don't think he's here tonight. But we're talking about the history of the just transition because the whole divide that we've seen between the environmental movement and the labor movement has very deep roots in capitalist history and capitalist environmental justice and injustice. And the design, as a design worker and a union worker myself, we fit very firmly into that narrative. You know, we know that, as first speaker said, that the whole the history of environmental injustice, environmental racism has been unequally distributed, that going back even to the Industrial Revolution, that it's working people, communities of color, immigrants, women, indigenous people have really borne the brunt of capitalist exploitation and capitalist destruction of the environment. There are a lot of examples we can give. Just picked a few here. The picture on the left is from the stockyards in Chicago when they just dumped unbelievable amounts of garbage into people's water supply. This picture was actually taken from a neighborhood. The people live there, and that's still going on. But it was the labor movement and the civil rights movement did take a stand against this as an extreme example of exploitation and racism and injustice. The book next to it, Packing Them In, is 150 years of African-American resistance in Chicago to this kind of really brutal lifestyle that came from the destruction of the environment. The picture next to it, of course, the amount of harm that the farm workers had to do because of environmental destruction, the workers and the crops being crop dusted by harmful pesticides, carcinogens that leached into the soil, leached into the water table. And the last picture is a Latinx neighborhood in LA that's next to an oil refinery plant. Because if we look at the history of where these things have been placed by city planners, often by architects, that the oil refineries, the landfills, the waste treatment plants, not surprisingly, get put in working class neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, neighborhoods that are inhabited largely by immigrants. And, there was, like I said, there was a long history, putting on my labor history hat here, of people fighting back against this, but from an example of extreme exploitation. And when the environmental movement started, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, things like that, they saw the global destruction of the environment didn't really make the class connection, didn't really make the profit connection or the racist connection, but that started to change in the 50s with labor organizers like Walter Reuther from the UAW, who did see environmental destruction by the auto industry, and especially by workers like him, Tony Mizzocchi, who was from the Oil and Atomic Workers Union, who really saw that the workers in his union were really being devastated by the environmental change and destruction coming from the oil and atomic industry, but also that it was one struggle, that you couldn't stop the exploitation, you couldn't stop the exploitation of the environment unless you really united. And internationally, there were people like Chico Mendes, if people heard of him, who was fighting against the exploitation of workers and destruction of the Amazon, and was actually killed by the logging industry in the late 80s. And I just love his quote, "Environmentalism without class struggle is gardening," which is a little extreme, but he also said that he didn't have a lot of trust for people who love the trees but ignored the people starving under them. And again, he saw it as one struggle, fighting against exploitation of workers and of the environment. But there has been change, and there were clashes. Like I said, there's not only a gap often between the environmental movement and the labor movement, but there's been also conflict based around jobs, because as people have said, that's the decision that capitalism gives us. You've got to work on whatever you have to work on to feed your family, and this is where design workers are fully plugged into this narrative. We might not want to work on an environmentally destructive luxury tower, but if that's what the boss gives us to design to pay the rent, that's kind of what we have to do. But this was an example in the Pacific Northwest where there had been conflict between Earth First and groups like that, actually spiking the redwoods to prevent them from being knocked down, and the loggers, but there was the Green New Deal for this area that did try and save the law, that did try and save both the environment and jobs at the same time, again, trying to bridge the gap and making sure that we see the underlying profit destruction as the common enemy. And so again, the line that transition is inevitable, justice is not. A lot of people on the frontline communities, whether it's environmentally or neighborhoods that have borne the brunt of this kind of capitalist ongoing profit motive destruction, have heard about a just transition, but it is most often bullshit, like when one schmuck in Congress a few years ago said the way to wean off fossil fuels in Appalachia is to teach coal miners to computer program. Okay, not that they can't learn it, they just can't feed their families that way. And that's the kind, we see that a lot now with gentrification of neighborhoods, speaking of that change is inevitable and everybody will benefit, but we know that's absolutely not true unless we actually do fight for the just transition that bridges the gap between environmental destruction and labor destruction.
Well, skipping ahead, I think it's important to keep Josh's words in mind, that we're trying to sort of set the ground of the history of just transition. It's kind of originating moment in civil rights and kind of ground up and labor organizing, which, to get from there to actions as professionals or students who are going to be professionals, it's going to take a couple of pushes of that Coke machine to get it to fall. But you'll hear some repetition as we kind of try to build up that part of the argument. So this part, as I said, skipping ahead, you may know this one. It's One Bryant Park, completed in 2009, costing over $1 billion. It was the first tower receiving coveted LEED Platinum status. Touted as America's first green skyscraper, it checked off every LEED bullet point. Its urinals are waterless, its concrete contains blast furnace slag, and its water system recycles rainwater. But upon opening, One Bryant was found to be emitting 2 times the operational greenhouse gases as the Empire State Building, opened in 1931. How did One Bryant become the building that broke LEED? Well, glass and arrogance, mostly. All the facades are glazed the same with no overhang, no poche. Provision of the iconic crystalline form, touted as biophilic, winning out over the most basic of contextual passive strategies. Also, tenants are mostly financial services, so it's packed with electronics running 24/7, and the benefits of state-of-the-art management system were overestimated, compounded by higher comfort standards increasingly demanded in this type of Class A commercial building. But what if One Bryant had been better designed and engineered? Are sustainable skyscrapers really what we need? Is it enough to substitute a clean skyscraper for a dirty one? This idea of sustainability is a one-to-one substitution of products avoids talking about social relationships. We've seen the explosion of every kind of green product, material, assembly, and process, which, like the LEED accreditation itself, is marketed and implemented before and beyond regulators' ability to assess their claims. It's about the speed of implementation of some things and the kind of slow work of legislation and pushing against and building coalitions to kind of work against this. So what's going on? Well, facing massive impending risk, the capitalist class has begun to respond with increasing hysteria. They're well into hysteria. They fear risk to markets, risk to and fixed capital, risk to access to labor, but above all, the risk of regulation, and perhaps, for the dirtiest industries, risk of outright expropriation, the best thing that could ever happen to the oil and gas industry. Nationalization and decommissioning. What results is the fevered disavowal. We see companies like Milliken that Adair was talking about. So Milliken is a floor covering company. I work in commercial interiors, and I do a lot of hospitality work in my career, and Milliken they produce nylon carpets essentially and vinyl flooring. And this is PVCs. So they tout their product as environmental. They fill out all the EPDs, the environmental product declarations. The product is technically 100% recyclable, but guess what? How much gets recycled? About 7%. So most of the production is virgin material, and most of it ends up in landfill. And the production emits something, nitrous oxide, and it's not a good material. It's not a good industry. Milliken is essentially a chemical company that happens to have a use for petrochemical waste, which they turn into stuff that we walk on in hotels. So, but if you go to their website, like all the websites now, it's all about sustainability. It's all about green. It's all about here's what we're doing. Here's our recycling effort. And by the way, the effort is always kind of downstream. It's all about recycling and, you know, get your friends together and clean up a beach. This is how we're doing it. In fact, they're part of an alliance of companies, as Adair mentioned, which includes the top 8 plastic producers and PepsiCo, because single use, right? Plastics, and also the petroleum companies are part of this alliance to end plastic waste. And so their effort is to kind of green tidal wave of recycling efforts. And this is so that to deflect away from upmarket legislation that might actually restrict their production. Okay, so we see, on the other hand, reforms such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which again, in the face of systemic emergency, responds with a litany of market solutions, the socialization of investment risk, incentive nudges in the form of tax credits, and rebates for low carbon consumer goods. Rebates for low carbon consumer goods, electric vehicles, and heat pumps for suburban homeowners, shifting incentives to the voluntary actions of climate developers and consumers. Are people familiar with kind of the terms of the IRA with regard to the built environment? Is this Greek? Okay, just curious. Thumbs up. The IPCC report that came out this year on the effect of the building industry on climate, we know IPCC, yes, okay, acknowledged a trend of improvement among individual buildings worldwide in emissions reduction, elimination of waste, better land and water management. However, in aggregate, my phone ringing. Not now, darling. However, in aggregate, yeah. From 1990 to 2019, global CO2 emissions from buildings increased by 50%. During the same time, overall global energy demand in general grew by just 38%. So our building industry is going in the wrong direction due to what? The problem is that improvements in efficiency are continuously outpaced by growth in floor area per capita. Okay, this I took off the internet. And I saw a couple other like market reports, the ones you can just sort of find for free. They're all kind of in this vicinity. It was just, you know, that might not be exactly right, and I haven't vouched for it. I'm not an economist, but it's kind of sobering that this is the global construction market, okay? That's money. It's not built stuff, but what does the money mean? It means that there's material throughput, there's energy use, so you're gonna have to cut emissions for your buildings by more than 50%, by 50% just to stay even. You know, not to mention knock-on effects of land use and all these other horrible things. Okay. Again, gains in efficiency are outpaced by ever-expanding development. Bear in mind, this is not about matching population growth. The industry is not incentivized to house people or better their quality of life. This is the processing of material and space for the express purpose of extracting value, powered by the engine of human need, not designed to satisfy it. We have to start seeing efficiency as the diet soda of climate solutions, increasing your need for caffeine bumps, spiking your insulation, and slowly killing you. But hey, from day one, we've been groomed to hustle and grind, so it's really no wonder that a profession obsessed with productivity and work would embrace as its prime tool carbon accounting, as though the feverish tallying up of embodied carbon all up and down the entirety of global supply chains over the entire life cycles of products and buildings, were it possible, would provide the metrics for managerial control and not merely bury junior and mid-level architects in a landslide of data to process. I mean, those of you who are working, what happens when there's an ethical campaign in your office? Does that translate to a higher fee? Are your clients kind of you know, no doubt well-meaning. Everyone around the conference table really wants to do the right thing. And I'm not saying this cynically, I actually think it's the case. But in fact, as projects are priced and the cost of this kind of accounting gets factored in, either it's junior level people sort of doing it because they're good professionals that have a duty to society, you know, per their AIA oath that they took in the Code of Ethics. And so they get stuck with more work. Design and construction leaders that's not mine, but I had to put it up. Design and construction leaders are at the center of market solutionism. The architecture lobby calls for the building industry to start on the path of broad economic and political change needed to address the urgency of climate breakdown and the breadth and depth of the injustice at its core. For the professional schools, the lobby demands academics lead on climate by making coordinated, time-limited demands on your institutions to shift pedagogy and divest from real estate and carbon economy investments. I'm sorry that kind of got shot down as somehow impossible thing to do, or like out of the realm of, you know, that your university, you know, it's beyond the pale to consider divesting from real estate for reasons that are beyond you and me, right? Self-evident. For the design press, end your inane glorification of luxury eco-homes, eco-travel destinations, eco-airports, and car-centered programs. Just transition matters for architects because what the mainstream leadership has offered in the face of impending catastrophe, a green tsunami of products and carbon accounting schemes, is grossly inadequate to the task. At best, industry advocates little more than tepid incrementalism and downstream circular economy principles for architects and consumers. At worst, the strategies of our leaders are diversionary and opportunistic, playing out a kind of climate theater serving to absolve its actors of their complicity. And it's not, it includes kind of the progressive enlightened architects in the city. This is images from the Brooklyn Queens. AIA has a yearly golf outing, which is a fundraiser for a scholarship. So if you're interested in noblesse oblige, you can do that. Their acquiescence in the face of extractive and exploitative nature of ever-expanding development does more than brand them as complicit. As presumed custodians of the built surround and protectors of public welfare, they provide the necessary legitimization, legal, aesthetic, and moral to those who benefit most. For now, architects must continue to push on every lever available to enact reform at every scale. All the strategies that you know about, electrification, densification, reuse and assembly, loose fit, passive house, preserving carbon sinks and better water management, distributed power, public transit, public housing. These are reforms architects have the power to advocate for and must. But in addition to practice reforms, we recognize with humility that not all problems are design problems. What's called for now is the refusal to remain silent and allow ourselves to be atomized, set in economic competition with one another, and coerced into compliance. What's called for now is pivoting to advocacy and activism outside our assigned lane. At this point, you might be asking, what can I do? Just kidding. Join a union. Building a political coalition can be slow work, and the powers aligned it are staggering and insidious. But we must. We've run out of time.
So Martin laid out why a just transition matters to us, in particular, as design workers. And now I'm going to cover the groundwork we need to do as we begin organizing for that transition. The just transition our group envisions is one that comes from the bottom up. To achieve this, and any real change in the way we work more broadly, we need to start by building collective power. Building power begins with engaging others, your classmates and your coworkers, to talk about the conditions of our work. Architectural work can be incredibly isolating and competitive, and that inclination should be the primary focus of our organizing, at least to start. A just transition is an opportunity to shape entirely new ways of practicing architecture. But there's some critical work we need to do in preparation for that at different scales, beginning with the specific material conditions of our labor and extending to the larger social structures that work is situated within. Let's talk about our shared experiences at work and at school. We need to build solidarity by talking to each other about the baggage we're carrying from the way we've learned to practice until now. It's impossible for us to completely throw off what we've learned, but it's also critical that we identify the oppressive structures within practice that need to change, including long hours, unrealistic project deadlines, and a lack of work-life balance. These things are actively preventing us from being able to take on the larger organizing work that we need to do as part of a just transition. Then, let's talk about the limitations of architectural practice in its current form. That is, as a service design within an incredibly capital-driven industry, construction. There's a lot to unpack here, from the economy of practice itself, with firms needing to balance good projects with projects that pay the bills, to the economy of the construction industry that our work is beholden to, which many have already spoke about, which is bound by the inertia around existing extractive supply chains, exploitative labor practices designed to maximize profits, and the commodification of land and the built environment. Practice, as it exists now, is incapable of decarbonizing in a just way. We need new forms of practice. Then, let's talk about the new ways of working and living we envision in a just future. Talking about how we work and what new forms of practice might be also means talking about how we live, or how we could live. Drawing on Olufemi Otaiwo's constructive view of reparations, we could think of a just transition as a political project to create tomorrow's just world and justly distribute the costs and burdens of that creation in light of yesterday's injustice. If we accept that the world we live in right now is broken, we need a vision for the world we're transitioning to, one that's ecologically, racially, and socially whole. And we need to build that vision together, in coalition with other workers and organizations, in a way that gives people the political power to affect change in their daily lives. Unions will help us get there. While unions aren't the only means of building collective power, we do think that unionization is critical to the success of large-scale collective action across our sector. And I'll tell you why. In the short term, unions provide a framework for talking to our coworkers and building power within our workplaces as we begin to imagine what better conditions look like for design workers. In the long term, achieving union density, which means having a high percentage of design workers organized, translates to the collective power we need to challenge the forces pushing our work towards environmental and racial violence. One great example of what this could look like is the Chicago Teachers Union, who uses a tactic called bargaining for the common good. They organize under the premise that learning, working, and living conditions are not separate. So in addition to provisions meant to improve teachers' working conditions, they have also included demands in their collective bargaining agreements meant to improve conditions for students, including caps on class sizes, the expansion of art and music programs in underfunded schools, sanctuary school protections for students, and even access to affordable housing. They also regularly work in coalition with other unions and community organizations. So you have teachers recognizing that their own conditions are entwined with their students and using that to instigate systemic change. Design workers could do the same, allying with frontline communities as we work toward a just transition. Beyond this, unions can have a direct influence on policy through sustained lobbying. One example of this is healthcare workers organized through the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, who were instrumental in passing the Affordable Care Act. SEIU members engaged in canvassing to educate patients and community members about the benefits of the ACA before it passed. And they also directly engaged with legislators in support of the law. And most recently, SEIU members have compiled their stories as testimony supporting the ACA in the Supreme Court to help prevent its repeal. And design workers could do the same, using our collective power to advocate for just transition legislation that would support workers and communities through the rapid decarbonization of our economy. As workers, we need to reject the capitalist models of practice we have inherited. This won't be easy, but it is necessary. Then, together, we can dream of new, just ways of producing a different built environment, one that doesn't hinge on perpetuating centuries of ecological and racial violence.
All right. Yes, yes. So we've talked quite a bit already tonight. So I'm the last one of the chair. So this is our last section. But we've talked about who we are. We've talked about the conditions of our labor, our lack of power as architects and design professionals, the need for a just transition for the building sector and our industry, the history of a just transition, what it might really mean for our profession, and the need to talk and organize. So this section, we're really going to think about what it means to act. So let's act. To create an equitable and just climate future requires acting now and acting together. It's important to acknowledge that current models of development are not inevitable. They are, in fact, also constructed. So what this means is that decisions made today in climate and labor policy will absolutely shape the built environment for years to come. Existing neoliberal policy legitimizes and protects business as usual, sanctifying it with tax credits and zoning exemptions. Together, as design workers and other building sector workers, we can speak directly to legislators about our vision for a just transition and demand new forms of work that enable new forms of living. And as Caitlin outlined, to achieve the just transition our group envisions, we need a bottom-up process that includes input from workers and frontline communities, but also engages with policy and policymakers. So one recent project our group took on was to engage with several pieces of Green New Deal legislation and ultimately to write our own policy response document. As Elisa mentioned at the start of the lecture, it's a fairly extensive document. It's over 30 pages. And we wrote this document specifically for legislators and policymakers, and specifically to point out impediments and choke points in the legislation that may otherwise be difficult to identify from outside the design and construction professions. We wanted to lend our expertise to ensure that the goals of G&D legislation, if passed, would be met and not co-opted by status quo forces of development and fossil capital. So the report was divided into two kind of sections, a policy commentary and proposals, which was the maybe 3/4 of the report, and a call to action. In the report, we identify 8 areas of concern that we believe are crucial, but have not been properly represented in G&D legislation released thus far. You can see those listed there up on the screen, everything from emissions and metrics to land use and density. Each of these sections has a series of position statements, a set of issues based on those position statements, and then proposals to deal with them. After writing this policy response document, we sent it to a variety of legislative offices in the House and the Senate, with the goal of meeting with them to discuss our proposals and to both help them and to lobby them for more immediate and aggressive climate-focused legislation. To date, we've met with a number of offices, including those on the screen, and we continue to develop those relationships and others. As we do this work of connecting with policymakers, it's important to acknowledge that years of organizing have put legislation that directly addresses the need for a just transition on the table already. And we wanted to highlight a few of those and how they intersect with our efforts. So the Green New Deal for public housing was an integral piece of legislation that impacted the writing of our policy response document. Passing it would repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment and provide funding to directly address the housing crisis, its decarbonization, and the immense backlog of basic repairs to public housing, which are all inextricably linked to the devastation wrought by climate breakdown. Similarly, legislation like the Climate Resilience Workforce Act would open new avenues for design labor to address climate and reduce the dependence of our livelihoods on private development. It funds the creation of a climate resilience action plans at various scales, while also creating an Office of Climate Resilience within the White House to coordinate those plans. It funds workforce development programs and removes barriers to employment. Because of the relationship the G&D Working Group developed with Representative Jayapal's office, who released the legislation, or introduced it, rather, the Architecture Lobby as an organization was able to be an initial endorsing organization when the legislation was introduced into Congress earlier this year. The Protecting the Right to Organize, or PRO Act, is another important piece of recent legislation introduced that would protect the basic right to join a union and to close loopholes that corporations use to exploit workers. In this way, passing the PRO Act would help to facilitate winning unions of architectural workers, especially in right-to-work states. The Architecture Lobby as an organization supports the PRO Act, and we have a campaign working to help get it passed. Additionally, the lobby also has a unionization campaign, helping to educate and support architectural workers interested in unionization. In the context of achieving a just transition for architecture, passing the PRO Act is an act of meaningful solidarity with our comrades in the building trades, who in addition to routine wage exploitation often face unsafe and life-threatening working conditions. So as workers, let's demand that our representatives pass legislation that supports deep decarbonization and justice, from the ways we design and construct the built environment to the ways it serves frontline communities who already bear the brunt of environmental devastation. So in addition to the legislative work, we wanted to share several other initiatives we've been working on as other examples of what it might mean to act. We're currently a co-sponsor of an effort to defend New York City's Local Law 97, known as the Buildings Mandate, which we heard a little bit about in the first presentation. But for those who might not be familiar, this is the centerpiece law for the New York City Climate Mobilization Act of 2019 and sets aggressive emissions targets for buildings in New York City over 25,000 square feet. The implementation of the law is being undermined by real estate and fossil interests, and the mayor's office has also been unclear in its commitment to the law's proper implementation. Our efforts have been focused on helping to build a coalition of architects, engineers, and designers alongside frontline communities to push back against these undermining forces and to support the intended implementation of the law. We are working with the New York City chapter of Science for the People and the New York Review of Architecture to plan an organizing event in early November that will bring together supporters of Local Law 97, climate-conscious practitioners from New York's construction and building sector, and Red Hook Brooklyn community leaders and activists, all with the support of Councilwoman Alexia Aviles, who represents the Red Hook and Sunset Park districts of Brooklyn. And there will likely be another event in the spring to engage further with architects, engineers, students, and frontline communities, and possibly even taking place here at Cooper, so stay tuned. I don't know if I was supposed to say that, but. We've also just finished writing a pamphlet called A Just Transition for the Building Sector, and it's literally hot off the presses. It's essentially a synthesis of the presentation we've been giving tonight, but in a pocket-sized form. To help develop the pamphlet, we held an open working group meeting of the G&D Working Group earlier this summer on a very warm evening at the Citigroup space in Chinatown. Maybe some of you were even there. It was great to connect with folks in person and create a space for many young architects and designers to share their experiences about the conditions of their labor and their concerns about the failure of the profession to adequately address climate breakdown. Out of these conversations and others, we further developed the JT pamphlet. We imagine it will help communicate why a just transition for the building sector is important for architectural and engineering workers to talk about, and that it could help to directly organize and mobilize workers toward meaningful change in the industry. And we do have some prints that we're going to hand out shortly here in the auditorium. And we'll actually show you how to fold them. But a couple more slides. So the Architecture Lobby, as was introduced previously, has many wide-ranging campaigns and working groups, some of which we've already mentioned. And as a national working group within the lobby, the Green New Deal Working Group meets regularly Mondays in the evening on Zoom. But there are various ways to engage and tap into what we're doing beyond some of the initiatives mentioned. And we also have a monthly meeting devoted specifically to a reading group. And you can see on the screen some of the texts and things that we've been reading. And I believe our next reading group session is November 21st, so a little bit from now. But we also continue to organize and host in-person events when possible. So please, we invite anyone listening to us tonight here in person or on Zoom to reach out, attend one of our regular meetings, a reading discussion, or an in-person event. We're always interested in discussing ideas and strategies. And as you can see, we have a number of different projects and efforts that are happening right now and evolving probably as I speak. So there are many possible ways to get involved with the group. And lastly, I'll just come out and say it, we need your help. These issues are big and thorny and complicated and not easy, as you've heard about for the duration of the evening. But working together to share in the fight really helps. So we welcome you all to join our efforts and to work towards achieving a just transition for architecture. So we do have some pamphlets that we wanted to hand out and show you all how to fold them. So we have some helpers to do that. Yeah, well, volunteers. So anyone who wants one, we'll maybe assume you want one, but if you don't, that's okay too. So the pamphlet, as I've described it, it's sort of readily printable. We printed these it's formatted to 11 by 17. We are going to plan to have digital copies available too, but we thought it would be fun to also walk you through how to fold it and turn it into one of these small little pocket-sized things that you can take with you very easily. So I'll wait one more second while they get handed out, and then we'll just go through the last 3-4 slides, and then we will open it up for questions, I believe. So if you take the pamphlet and orient it the way that it is on the screen, you're going to fold, basically the whole process is folding it in half 4 times. So if you orient it the way it is on the screen now, with the kind of title on the top left, and fold it backwards in half, where this line is. So folding it from the middle back, you're going to end up with something like that. So you want to fold it horizontally first. So, oops, sorry, this. So have we gotten this far? What's that? You gave away the ending. I know, well, it's sort of already given away. All right, well, if you made it this far, then you want to fold it forward and to the right. And you should get something like that. How many people have this? More than half. All right. And then the last move is just to fold again horizontally in the middle and fold that back. Or sorry, second to last. Until you get our TAL GND working group logo and the title of the pamphlet. And then one more time in the middle, you fold it back and to the right, and you end up with a pocket-sized just transition for the building sector pamphlet. Any pocket, it can go in any pocket. And we have many more if you want to take some with you and pass them out to whomever you think might be interested. Yes. So I think with that, I don't know, I guess, Elisa, we turn it back to, are you host or no, I don't know. You're filling multiple roles, but. Yeah, I don't know. Really don't know.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. So at this point, I think we would like to just open to discussion. I mean, I think if there are any questions or even comments, we're happy to treat this almost as a roundtable too. We can be casual about it. So I'll just open it to the floor. Are there any questions or comments? And we're also taking questions from the Zoom as well. Yeah, Jacob, go ahead. Yeah, there's a mic up here. Well, the Zoom needs to hear you, so I believe in your abilities, but.
So it seems that industry perpetuates a disconnect of people from each other.
Wait,
and
hold
their
on. I don't think this mic is on. Can you guys hear in the back? Can you hear it in the booth?
Hello.
Okay, there you go. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. It seems industry perpetuates a disconnect of people from each other and their environment. This damages our planet, yes, but simultaneously we damage our connectivity to each other socially. If these coincide, must we first mend our social disconnects to properly address our environmental struggles to actually make a proper difference?
Hello, hello. Okay. So I think that's a great question, important question. Not an easy one to answer, like probably all the questions we might have thrown at you tonight and also we might hear. But I think what I would say is maybe just give like a personal reaction, which is to say, I think the work that we've been talking about, not just the issues, but the actual work and the coming together of a group like this, I've personally found to be like exactly what you're talking about. That it's of course outside of practice in its traditional form, but it provides other ways of connecting and socialization and learning. And I think, right, like we're doing here, organizing. And that leads to other things. I don't think it's like, for me anyway, a direct, okay, now I'm gonna go into the office and do a project that I really believe in. And so it's like a different space. But I think from what we've tried to present tonight, at least ideas, opportunities, avenues down which can lead to hopefully future change within the profession itself. So I think I'm sort of just reacting to what you're mentioning about sort of like reconnecting with people and each other and like valuing those relationships, valuing interaction, talking about things that you didn't know about that you're actually realizing are exactly what you're feeling or thinking. Or, I mean, I mentioned the reading group, like, I don't know, just the things that we've read in the reading group have been really enlightening and broadening and begin to filter in, I guess, to all other things that one might be talking about or thinking about within the design context. That actually translating into the profession and daily work, I think, as we've tried to present today, is like not instantaneous and like needs to happen, in my opinion, on like many different levels simultaneously and scales. But I'd say personally, these kinds of the interactions that we've had within this group and let's say the architecture lobby more generally, it is a space that those things kind of automatically are happening. Like that's sort of a big part of the way that we work, the way that we talk, the way that we share ideas. So for me, like personally, I think that that's been a really important kind of experience that begins to address, I think, some of the things that you're talking about in terms of the value of that kind of social connection.
And I would just add to that that, I mean, when we talk about unions, this is kind of exactly what we're talking about. So unions provide one way of restructuring our relationships to each other, but also to groups outside of architecture in a sort of formalized way. So it's really about having a system in place that allows us to articulate our shared goals in a way that is binding in some regard.
I would say that seizing power and seizing pleasure might have like a lot of overlap and might actually have the same solution, which is like making connections, which are at this point in time almost transgressive what we do, just the fact that we meet up every Monday night. And you know, it's been said that because it's slow work and it sometimes doesn't feel like it's doing anything except for, you know, we feel good because we've connected with each other just as human beings who have similar goals and interests, right? And are not going crazy because everyone's saying something different or ignoring what's right in front of them. So we sometimes say that TAL is like AA, where, you know, if you're feeling not like hopeless, just keep coming. So, because it serves a function, and that function is real. It's like political praxis. It's conviviality, and we party, we do stuff in person, not just like,
yeah, we write papers, but it's not drudgery. It's like, it's work that doesn't feel like work. I do this every minute of every day that I'm not like just, you know, paying my due to Caesar, what is due to Caesar. And so, you know, if you want to come check us out, we're nice and fun.
He's nice and fun. I can't speak for myself. No, I really like the question. It has a lot of broad implications, but on a practical level, you know, I think that, you know, in terms of breaking down social barriers, if we're talking about, for instance, just like uniting with construction workers, that's a big leap for most architects. I mean, I was a construction worker for a little while after college, and, you know, I can tell you, construction workers sit around at lunchtime and talk about what a bunch of assholes architects are, you know, and same thing in my office, with the way they talk about the contractors, you know, and nobody really involves the users, you know, like I work at the housing authority, and public housing now is being sold, right? And trying to get housing authority workers and residents and the community to defend an institution like public housing is difficult. There's a lot of siloing going on. So I think that, you know, your question has a lot of really practical implications, and a lot of times it's easier said than done to break that down, because I know even within my union, you know, the professional white-collar titles can have a really condescending outlook towards the blue-collar titles, even though we're in the same union. So I think, you know, breaking down those kinds, being open about those kinds of barriers and actually working to break them down either on a collective level or one by one is really an essential part. So, you know, I think it's a really, really valid point.
I think it also goes against the kind of historic trend that the United States, at least, has been going down for the last 50 or 60 years, which is of increasing atomization through suburbia, through individual car ownership, through the dissolution of social groups like the Lions Club. And not that those things were perfect in and of themselves, they had a lot of problems with them, but we used to be a much more social country. We used to have much more social ties. And I don't think that's accidental. I don't think that's something that's happened just incidentally. I think that's been a deliberate strategic move on the form of the people that build these suburbs and that build these cars, because when we're not together, when we're not working together and talking together, we're easier to control and we have less power. And I think that what you were talking about the kind of the subversiveness of just coming together once a week and talking amongst one another is actually true. And I think that there's deeper political implications to that as well that we should consider.
I mean, I think that like this working together is like an opportunity to like ask, the questions aren't kind of possible separate, right? And I mean, there's something to thinking with other people that like makes these kind of large questions possible. And otherwise it's really, really, really impossible. And the special thing to me about this group, and I was like a student 4 or 5 months ago, is like seeing people working in all different industries, encountering the same problems from very different perspectives. And that like ability to like talk across like experience and to like frame these questions together is really, really valuable. And this kind of like opportunity to think through these issues and read together, it's like a special space, and it's not quite like school, and it's not quite like building like a personal idea of something, but like coming to an understanding through like those cross perspectives that like it makes like organizing interesting, like yeah, cultural, I don't know. So I'll pass it to our host.
We all have different things to say about everything, so that's part of what makes our meetings enjoyable. But I'll actually just add one more thing too, because I know what classes you're taking, and I know who your professors are, and I know I know where you live. No, I actually don't. But no, I think your question also comes from a particular place of thinking through the relationship between architectural work and the social realm. And it's something that comes up in the studio, and it's something that within the studio is sometimes difficult to deal with because we feel removed from the communities that we are perhaps studying, or we're kind of looking at things from an aerial view, and it becomes difficult to understand how we're actually embedded. And that struggle, there are many different answers to that question. And so I think that sometimes from a pedagogical standpoint, there is this question of how we treat the social realm within the design studio. And I think that that's also in part where your question might be coming from. But my answer to that would not be to say that I know exactly where that intersection lies, but to actually point out the fact that sometimes we don't see ourselves as part of that larger social system. We see ourselves as an imposition on it, as though somehow the architect is either neutral or always this kind of top-down view that has to always be external. And we don't always address the political economy of the built environment. And the fact that we are embedded in an economy that is kind of processing all of that material and producing those built environments, so that we have to actually not just think about how we design communities as a design project, but we have to think about all of the economies and institutions that we are embedded into. And so for me, this is also how this actually is somehow directly correlated to our design work, even if they are different questions that come than what come up in the studio. If that makes sense. Well, now that you got an answer from everybody, are there any other questions? Yeah. Come up to the mic.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really honored to be organizing with a lot of you these days and look forward to doing a lot more of that together. I have a question about unions because it sounds like you all are grappling with the same stuff that my union grapple with. I represent workers at the Army Corps of Engineers, so very similar, same industry, right? Built environment. And you know, one of the things, having a union doesn't immediately translate into having an industrial agenda. Quite the opposite, in fact. I'd say most unions do not have an industrial vision and have a pretty narrow approach. And you know, if you look at the main unions in the built environment that are active in our city, insofar as they have any industrial policy, it's just tailing the developers, right? They'll just take any job, and it's closely connected to their precarity. So I guess it's a big strategic question. I don't expect a wrapped up answer, but I just want to put it out there for everybody's consideration, which is what's the relationship between the organization around working conditions and addressing issues like precarity as exist in our industry, and how do you both use that to connect to a bigger vision, and how do you do both of those things simultaneously, the smallest of pictures and the biggest of pictures? How do you do them at the same time in such a way that you know, doesn't feel contradictory, but rather actually feels necessary if you're going to be successful in unionizing an industry that isn't yet unionized, in at least the private sector?
Caitlin? Yeah.
So thanks, Chris, for that question. I think that that's a super important question, and I think we realize, the lobby realizes, and all the folks who are involved in union organizing right now in the sector realize that having a union is not a solution per se. You know, we have a lot of comrades in other countries that are unionized who are obviously still forming lobby chapters and facing the same sort of you know, challenges that we're facing here in an ununionized sector in the States. And you know, I think that in a lot of ways that is something that we can use to our advantage when it comes to climate, because we're organizing right now and we have a chance to you know, form new alliances with each other that have this as one of the sort of founding principles, right? And so I think that it's really about the terms that we organize on to start now and what we think that we can win from having unions in the private sector in the US, and really like putting that front and center and understanding from the start that this is one of the things that we want to win, that it's about our working conditions, but it's also about this bigger thing. And so that's why, you know, when we talk about like all the things we need to talk about as part of a just transition, there's all these different scales, because it's not just the immediate, it's also having a really solid picture of what that thing is that we're working toward and that we want to win together.
I can just add one more thing as well, is that, you know, there's a larger unionization project within the lobby, and then there is a kind of sub-project within our working group. And I think that something that we add to this conversation is about redefining how we think about precarity and what causes precarity, and having it not just be about, how many hours we work and what our compensation is, although that of course is part of it, but to bring in a conversation around the fact that our very work is made untenable by the climate crisis. And so bringing that conversation into our understanding of our own precarity and the precarity of our labor becomes quite important, I think, to our group. And so we, I think, try to open up this conversation around dissatisfaction on different terms, and also bringing to light the fact that we're not often satisfied with the impact that our work had. We're not happy with it, right? And so in that sense, that's also what gave birth to our effort to actually speak directly with policymakers, because there was a moment where we felt that the change couldn't happen from inside the economy that we were part of. The economy couldn't reorient itself. And so that was part of our effort to actually try to lobby, which, the primary lobbying group is the AIA, which follows precisely the logic that you said, which is protecting jobs. And so protecting existing jobs in architecture, climate-wise, is no longer tenable because of what the built environment really is made out of. So we've tried to expand that conversation and bring that into the union, like the conversation around organizing at least. And our position on unions are that unions, because they can produce a kind of solidarity, are an important building block for that, if that makes sense. So we have some more questions lined up here.
Thanks for the talk. There's a lot of great points made. I apologize in advance for bringing it back to a design question, but I wondered if, since a lot of you are architects, have you envisioned what a non-capitalist architecture might look like? I think you've so eloquently pointed out that this sort of ethical capitalism is not sufficient in dealing with the planetary scale problem of climate change. And so I'm wondering, I think you sort of alluded to, what might a non-capitalist architecture for, model for a skyscraper might look like? I think, at least personally, I think because we operate in design and this is our area of expertise, it could be worthwhile to imagine what it might look like in its sort of a tangible form. Thank you.
I think one of the answers to that question is that we really think that that's something that we have to design all together. So our group of, our working group has maybe, 15 to 20 members off and on. And so that's not something that we can, envision by ourselves. But the lobby does have a lot of ideas about how we shift toward that. Unionization being one step, cooperativization being another step. The sort of build out of the public sector design work being another step. So, our working group has been really focused on how federal funding for just different models of construction could really help to transform the way that we procure buildings and procure the built environment. And, that alone could be pretty transformational in terms of reorienting who makes decisions and who benefits from those decisions when it comes to the built environment.
Just take a very quick step back. I just want to add one thing to the last question, which is that when I was growing up, almost 40% of the working class in this country was in unions. And now in the private sector, it's down to under 10%. So I think that, the fact that architects are designing or unionizing is, but there are, taxi drivers and car wash workers and adjunct professors and a lot of people who hadn't been organized previously are now on the move, in contrast to my union, which is a dinosaur union, and so that kind of dynamism in terms of organizing is something, if we're part of a larger movement, I think that's where we take inspiration from. If we have ties with them, I think that also, that kind of reciprocity would help. But in answer to his question, I think that, it's hard to envision a non-capitalist architecture, having, been working this for 30 years, but I think the one thing that we would change, I would throw out, is how we design and who's involved in the design process. As it stands now, not just with environmental issues, we don't design for the users, we design for the clients. It's the people who pay the bills, right? Those are the people who call the shots. Form doesn't follow function, form follows finance. I didn't come up with that phrase, but I love it. And, because it's really, that's how things do get designed. And even working in the public sector, a lot of times, user input is required by law, but it's a very pro forma process, right? It's just, basically, it is who funds the projects. And, the design process is very linear, starting with the finance as opposed to having a more collective process that involves the users, the construction workers, and even, and even in terms of once something is built, we never do post-occupancy evaluations, right? We just walk away once the bills are paid. I think, looking at that kind of experiential process would also be something that would change once you remove the profit motive from the design process. So I'm desperate for that.
We also have a lot of questions in line. Okay, let's go to the next one. So, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just remind everyone.
I'm going to say no. No, we can't imagine anything outside of capitalism. It's a closed system, capitalist realism. There's no glance between people. There's no gesture. There's no breath. It's not imbricated always already in means of production and the political economy. And maybe we're framing the problem wrong, and it's not kind of about imagining architecture outside of capitalism, but just more kind of tactics and interventions that, and this could be a shift in the pedagogy and a shift in practice where it's maybe less about big vision, which is not to say that there can't be big things. I think there's maybe two sides. There's there's the little communitarians who just want to build small stuff with local materials, and then there's taking over the electrical generation plant. So that's architecture too, which is kind of like a reuse and renovation when we can kind of tell Con Ed that we're doing public power, and then we just build accordingly.
I'm a landscape architect, and I just wanted to throw my seed in there that I think there is landscape architecture beyond capitalism, rebuilding coral reefs, daylighting streams for salmon habitats, looking at non-human users of space, and creating space that serves non-human, non-profit-driven needs in that way. Ecological restoration of coal mining sites and clear-topped mountaintops, kind of undoing the harm that has been done for no profit. Humans don't live there, humans will not experience it. Space is not for humans, I would say would be the one dart I would throw on that board.
Okay, well, we have a mix of questions in line. Are you sure? Okay, I just want to make sure we have time for everybody. So, Mesli, why don't you go next, and we have a question from the Zoom, so then we'll go to Patrick and then another Zoom question, just to intersperse the Zoom sphere a little bit.
Yeah, so thank you. The biggest question I have is there was these lexicon of different vocabulary that you guys presented tonight, but I think the first time, at least with my kind of, research, I guess you could say, with the idea of climate and architecture, it's the idea of this regenerative. And I think this is the first time that I've actually heard that term in this kind of conversation. So I was wondering, and then you briefly spoke about it in terms of landscape, but is there different ways that we can approach, and how do you guys kind of formulate these underlying kind of systems of commodification and consumption that drives almost all capitalist societies? How does the idea of regenerative kind of take you back and help you reassess the actual problem? And what do possible solutions look like?
I just want to say something real quick. So one thing we didn't get into was some theorists make a distinction between circular economy and regenerative economy. I don't know if people are aware of this, but a lot of the corporations have appropriated circular economy, because this again is the downstream recycling, right? Where basically, okay, well, all the materiality goes round and around, but regenerative actually has reparations incorporated into it, so you're making up for the historical carbon debt, and so you have to actually have inputs for the reparations. That's just a small point.
I think I would also just add that for the idea of like a regenerative, not just economy, but like a regenerative way of life to work, we have to have a really different relationship to land itself. And we have to have different settlement patterns. And that is something that we cannot necessarily change project by project. And that's where, again, understanding that our work is embedded in a very specific political economy really matters, because in many ways, it's the very economy of the built environment itself that prevents, is an obstacle to the kinds of changes that we need. And so on one hand, and you as my students, you know that I believe in our ability as designers to project that vision. And as Caitlin said in her section, we have to have a vision of what we're transitioning to. And so we can help to produce that vision. But as long as our actual day-to-day labor is embedded in this economy, which unto itself is one of the obstacles to bring about any of those visions, then, you know, what are we really doing? And so I think there has to be this coupling with the production of those visions, and we had the other question about that as well, but with this understanding that there's a question of power involved in that that is very problematic and very thorny. And so if we want to enact any of those visions that we think could bring about a regenerative way of sustaining human life, then the way that we practice has to change. So in terms of our group, we're very much focused on that aspect of changing the profession and changing practice and recontextualizing our work through that lens. But I think there have to be like any number of actual proposals, because it's not going to be the same from one location to another. I think the transition has to be heterogeneous. We can no longer, of course, as we know, believe in any kind of modernist tabula rasa. So there is no one solution. So this really is a project for architecture as a discipline to take on. And for that to happen, the profession has to change. So I think we can't think about one without the other. Okay, let's take a question from the Zoom, which I have a connection to the Zoom sphere via Mauricio in the back. So this is a question from Nora Akawi, who unfortunately we can't just pipe her in because the speaker isn't quite working. But she says, thank you for the presentation. I saw that one of the readings is of the Red New Deal, Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth. How would you fold decolonization into the work, not as a metaphor, but as land back? What have been or would be a decolonial Green New Deal design studio?
I can say that specifically one of our demands in the just transition for the building sector document was to earnestly consider repatriation of native lands that have been taken both within and without treaties, as what has happened in Oklahoma most recently, but that's one of the demands that we've made to legislators in this document. So I would say that would be a start.
I think that this is also a question of, you know, thinking about how we can engage other groups outside of our own. Like, obviously, we're a group of, you know, mostly architects practicing in New York, and, you know, we are not directly engaged in Indigenous organizing, but it is important for us to, as we, you know, develop this demand for a just transition, talk to folks who are doing that organizing and, you know, who are also doing that organizing here in New York, you know, talking about, like, really thinking about who is on the front lines of these issues and how can we engage them and how can we together shape a vision for a just transition that really accounts for, you know, the sort of breadth of those demands, and that really does make possible a different sort of future and a different way of living and being in relationship to each other.
Patrick?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was Googling to make sure I had the right numbers, but so something like 25% of projects involve architects, of buildings involve architects, only 2% of houses built in the US involve architects. So it seems like there would have to be some part of this that is bolstering the role of architects when our influence in this industry seems to be waning, if we're going to resist the capitalist mode of construction and refuse to do certain projects. So like, how do you do both? Like, how do you unionize and resist that method while also increasing our relevance in this industry?
That's a really good question. Another way of asking it is, if architects went on strike, would anyone care? So, like, what leverage do we actually have? I'd argue that we provide probably a lot of soft value that's not really monetized, which is, again, that kind of, legitimization by our professional standing for certain kinds of projects. Yeah, I mean, most of it doesn't need us because it's, increasingly standardized off-site, which is all to kind of like squeeze more labor out, and, technology just sort of like compounding and compounding due to the course of laws of competition. And the answer is, I don't know. I have no idea. But we can at least sort of form as a political coalition and do other things. We can lobby, we can demonstrate, we can advocate, we can do construction, we can work in the trades. You can go to architecture school and then go work on a construction site. You can be a construction manager. You can work in the products industry. I mean, unfortunately, like, there's no clean spot to work in. You have, it's this tension between having to, we are coerced labor, right? And let me just make one other point. So the AIA Code of Ethics has, one of the Code of Ethics is that you need to do no harm, just like a doctor. And so you should take care of the environment, you should do all these things. But we can't trace the whole supply chain. Everything eventually kind of goes, we have a global supply chain, and everything diffuses off into places where we don't have sight lines to the labor, whether it's coerced, and you have a whole industry of green products, green services that may employ coerced labor down the supply chain. So if you can't be sure, should you, ethically participate, or can you only use the most local of local materials that you can actually see that whole supply chain? It's a devilish kind of like problem. So none of us are perfectly clean in this system.
I was just going to add a couple of things, which is, that 2% is also probably, the 1% of the 1% who can afford the architect to build their second or third or luxury home. So even those projects that we actually are hired to do are for like a very elite group of people in and of themselves. And I think one thing that we need to do a better job of holistically from a professional standpoint is to be, despite the fact that we don't actually build buildings, we design them and we represent them. So despite our communication skills, I don't think that the profession has actually done a very good job at communicating our value and what we bring to projects in terms of all the questions, things about socialization, things about engagement with particular groups of people and designing spaces that meet their needs in specific ways. And that work is out there, but I don't think that it's necessarily communicated in a way that is really effective a lot of the time. And I think that that's something that as a profession we need to really think about. And the fact of the matter is we're not needed in most of those projects, which is why we're not hired. There's a way to do it. There's standard details. Process is there. Why would we hire the architect? It's just more money. The other thing I think that we should put on the table is actually rethinking our roles and responsibilities as an architect, as a designer, as a landscape architect, as a planner, And those are very different, which I think is like, in some ways, a lot of what we presented today is sort of reimagining ourselves more as political actors, or at least participating in a political process, a legislative process, et cetera. And I think that that's a really big shift for a lot of architects. And I would say, academics like myself and sort of people in terms of what we teach in the schools, and shifting like well, what does it mean to actually not really design a building, but to design a way of engaging with the community to see what they need, et cetera. So I think that how we define ourselves and also how we communicate those things are actually integral to showing our value, or value is maybe not the right word, but I can't think of a better one right now, but to kind of legitimize our place in the process as being important. And, you know, I don't think that we've done a really good job at actually questioning that about ourselves as a profession. I think we're happy to kind of like get those 1 or 2 commissions for a really like high-end client that's luxury residential in the city or out in the East End or something, and like feel good about it. And maybe it's a beautiful project, but most stuff, as you said, isn't actually benefiting most things that get built from the things that we have to offer.
No, just to build like really quickly on what Ryan was saying, you know, I think there's legislation like the Climate Resilience Workforce Act that, you know, include things like the creation of federal, state, and local climate resiliency action plans. And that's something that, you know, would cover sort of the gamut of response to climate-induced disaster. And it's something that, like, most definitely architects need to be a part of doing, right? And so right there you have the creation of jobs for architects to use their specific training that doesn't require, you know, practice as we know it. So, you know, when we talk about just transition legislation, we're really talking about avenues for creating new types of jobs for architectural and design workers that operate outside of that sort of traditional sphere of practice.
I would just add quickly that one of the few post-occupancy evaluations I read was of Corbusier's building La Unité in Marseille, and talked about, you know, what his design accomplished, what it didn't in terms of, you know, families and individuality and tiny bedrooms that drove people crazy, but the playground on the roof that people liked, kind of things. But one line in the article that I'll never forget says economics was the one dragon Corbusier could not slay. You know, that you can't really design capitalism away from your drafting table. You know, I would love to, but you can't. And not because I'm a lousy architect, it's because the limits of what, you know, what we do. And I think that that gets back to the question of what's our role in a larger movement. Like you're saying, you know, we definitely do have a role to play, but the 98% of housing that's not architect designed is purely produced for profit, right? And so it gets back to, you know, what, you know, trying to be a very vital part of the housing movement that does provide, looks at housing as a human right. And they're having examples like when architects have united with squatters movements, for instance, you know, to take over abandoned buildings and to try and, you know, lend their design skills to make sure that these buildings are habitable. So it's, again, it's a matter, I think, of reaching out, you know, and not thinking of what can we do, or what can we do when you unite with other people who have the common interest. We have skills to offer, and you have knowledge to offer, but by itself, you know, then we're just throwing ping pong balls at the wall. But we have those kind of allies, then we can really have a stronger movement, you know, to try and take over the abandoned buildings and look at things not designed for profit, and not drive ourselves crazy like Corbusier tried to do.
I might also add that we don't necessarily build that other percentage. I forget what the number was. But I think one of the things that we can offer is a way of looking at the built environment and a way of seeing what that is. And I think that there's a lot of architectural training that isn't put to use in practice in certain ways. And I think that, you know, there's a way in which the training of an architect and the education of an architect allows us to see certain problems in the built environment. And that, I think, was also very central to our lobbying effort and speaking to legislators, because there was all this legislation that had been written, but those of us that are embedded in the production of the built environment in one way or another, whether we're like in the trenches of education or in the trenches of practice, nonetheless, we are able to see certain things within the built environment that other professions simply don't come across because they're coming at it from a different angle, or their education is different, or whatever it might be. So I think that goes back to the point around reimagining our position and our role, but not just to say, let's not be architects anymore, but actually to say, as architects, there's a big part of what we do that is underutilized, but that can be quite useful for this moment of transition. And one thing we found when we spoke to legislators is that they were actually very hungry for the information that we had to offer, because their offices didn't actually have the capacity to kind of dive deep into some of the areas that they wanted to dive deep into. And so we just knocked on the door and said, hey, we have a lot of thoughts about the built environment, and they were very welcoming, and they were looking for that knowledge. And so I think as we reimagine our role, it's also for me a question of what architectural knowledge is and how it's disseminated. And that's a question of education, but it's also a question of seeing that a lot of what we get in our education then doesn't have a place in practice because of that profit-driven aspect to it, where the production of the built environment is for the sake of the economy itself. And so a lot of the other things that we look at when we're in school tend to fall by the wayside. And so reimagining what the architectural profession might be, as Caitlin was saying, I think has everything to do with kind of reincorporating what we can offer into new ways of like imagining where projects come from, and like, what is a project? Why are we building in the first place? I think we can add something to that conversation. So we're at 9 o'clock, and it's been 2 hours, 2 very lovely hours, but I don't want to hold anyone longer than we need to. But we will stick around here for a little bit if there are any other questions. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight.